Welcome to the Liquid Antiquarian.
Hi folks, we're back.
This episode starts with this little book and ends up with this, a real rum. A rum bottled by the Thompson Brothers up in Draught. You will see our little logo there, which we're really proud to have on the bottle. So, the source first. The Innkeeper and Butler's Guide, or a directory in the making and managing of British wines, together with directions for the managing, colouring and flavouring of foreign wines and spirits, and for making British compounds, peppermint, aniseed, shrub, etc., etc. It's the third edition, written by John Davis, published in Leeds in 1807, but it went through a number of editions from roughly 1800 into the 1820s. So what was the little thing in this book that intrigued us? Well, it's to do with rum, obviously. At the end of the entry about rum, it says, the casks of porter sent to the West Indies are often returned with rum, which is the best flavoured for its age of any that come to this country. I asked Dave if he knew anything about rum being matured in stout or porter casks, and he did not. And I don't think, had ever sold a cask, even though finishing rum is becoming a little bit more popular now. So that was very intriguing. It is quite categorical. Now, obviously, you can doubt whether that was true, I suppose. But this book was published, as I say, through very many editions. So presumably it was being bought in numbers. And even if it wasn't true at the beginning when Mr. John Davis wrote this, you could imagine that lots of people were following his advice, because it's quite categorical. And he doesn't say anything similar about the brandies that are mentioned in here. We spoke to Phil and Simon up at Draught Distillery. So they have this great, small, very innovative distillery up in Scotland where they're making malt whiskey and gin. They also are superb, brave, independent bottlers who do great things. We followed for some time and really, really enjoyed their output. They loved the reference and sourced an Imperial Stout cask from Black Isle Brewery. We transferred an 11-year-old Worthy Park rum from Jamaica. Very, very good rum distillery. And we put it into these casks. Originally, we were going to try and recreate the length of time it would take to get across the sea. And Phil even rigged up this kind of rocker device thing to simulate the the motion of the boat on the water. That broke after about a week. So in the end, we just decided to leave it a little longer and sugar it a bit. And in terms of the experiment, well, the rums would have come in these porter casks into the big ports like Leith, London, Belfast, Liverpool. And then they would have been bought in cask and then probably gone into the gantry or cellar of either an innkeeper or a butler. So a little bit more time sitting on the gantry seemed appropriate. Before we go any further, let's just try that rum. Let's try this finished product. So it's a Jamaican rum. So we talk about the Jamaican funk. So that means that they make this incredibly flavorful, intense rum through distillation, the way they distill it. It's all about getting massive ester impact. So fruity. It's like bruised banana, ripe pineapple, kiwis, pineapples, mango, green mango. You know, this big fruit bowl character, but then it also borders onto, this definitely has that, this almost glue-like element, which some people find odd when they first try it, but once you get into it, it's just so delicious. Further to this, there is a toasty, roasty, coffee, cocoa element to it. I had a wee bit of kind of creaminess, but I might be reaching there. That probably is to do with this 11 months in stout, and it certainly picked up some colour there as well. Dave, you've only got the pre-finished rum yet. I'm sending it down to you next week so you can try it. And it should be said from the outset that maturing rum in stout casks is not a common thing to do now. I'd never heard of it. It could have turned out strange. It hasn't turned out strange. It's turned out a little bit different, but it's worked. It's been really successful. So we're delighted with it. And yeah, thank you, Phil and Simon. That was great for trusting us, trusting our friends from the past to know something. They usually do. They usually do. We appreciate it.
It's all thanks to Phil and Simon, really, because without them coming on board saying, right, okay, we'll follow this kind of mad idea, we wouldn't be here talking about porter and stout, and also this absolutely fantastic rum. So thanks so much to the Thompson Brothers. They are doing remarkable work, and not just with their independent bottlings, but with what's going on at the Draught distillery, which is just absolutely great, and exactly the kick up the arse that the Scotch whisky industry has needed for a long time. So Phil, Sam, thank you very much indeed from the Antiquarians.
Yes, thank you. So before we dive into research, I just wanted to say a little bit more about the original source, this text, the J. Davies book. So written for innkeepers and butlers, two slightly different groups, but both handling drinks, alcoholic drinks principally, and purchasing them, storing them, and managing them, and in some cases improving them. It's packed full of tips, what tools to have that you're going to need in the cellar, a few techniques in terms of racking and storage and fining and allowing them to settle, and all these kind of useful tips on how to look after your booze effectively, including a little nugget for whiskey fans who know a bit about whiskey maturation, how to make a sulfur match, a large match using brimstone, which we would consider sulfuring a cask. If you know about that, it's a bit niche, but anyway. Also recipes for brewing your own beer, making your own cider, even making your own English wines. Some of them sound quite good, actually. I like the sound of sage wine, weirdly. Also, how to purchase spirits, how to keep wines and purchase wines. And then there is this element of management / improvement. I just want to say a few words on, because from current eyes, looking back, it looks some of it pretty wild, like weird ingredients like oyster shells, and also a very active process of managing. So actually adding other ingredients, for example, into claret to save a foul claret, adding apples in there, very different to how we would view it. But then we're not shipping claret in casks anymore, so you could have problems. So that side's possibly excusable, and you just have to recognize at different times. But there's also elements in here that feel a little bit nefarious. They feel a little bit dodgy. Well, firstly, I should mention adding lead to alcoholic drinks to keep it for longer. That sounds dangerous and not good for the master of the house or the guests of the hostelry that the innkeeper is welcoming. But also, for example, in the case of rum, they give precise instructions and calculations for how much money you can make if you cut and reduce your strong rum with other spirit. Molasses spirit actually is mentioned, but that's probably spirit distilled in the UK from molasses, which weirdly is not counted as rum in their eyes. but also instructions on how to add the bead back in. Now, if you're not aware of what bead is, so that's a reference to, if you shake a bottle of high strength spirit, and our rum is 54.7%, you'll see those bubbles that slowly pop and dissipate. The stronger the spirit, the bigger the bead, and the longer the bead remains. So if you were a consumer, it was a quick way of being able to tell how strong the alcohol is, given that it's been sitting on the gantry of the back bar and anything could have been added to it, as this book proves. So they tell you how to reduce the strength in this book, but also add that bead back in. That, to me, is effectively adulteration, is the term for it, that becomes a very hot topic later in the 19th century and earlier into the 20th century. I'm sure it's a subject we're going to return to. That said, if we come back to our reference for the Jamaican rum matured in porter casks, there's nothing dodgy about that. They're referring to when you buy it, i.e. before you muck around with it, this is the best stuff you can get. So it feels solid. Anyway, delighted with the little reference, and it's amazing where this one sentence has taken off your research, Dave. And I'm thinking about beer. Obviously, you're published in many subjects on alcohol, specifically whiskey and rum mostly. And for me, I don't come anywhere near to considering myself a beer expert. And I've almost deliberately kept it as just a drink that I don't learn about. I don't count it so much as part of my job. So I really use it as a relaxant. When I get home, I switch off. I'm not analysing it nearly so professionally as sometimes I do when I have a whiskey at home. I can't switch the old brain off to think about how it fits in commercially. Are you the same, Dave?
Yeah, I would agree, and it sounds like I'm doing beer down. But in those early days when I was off license news and thinking about going freelance and everything, it was kind of, well, I've written about beer, etc., etc. But it was a whole new world that I would have to explore because it's incredibly complex and it's fascinating and everything. And I just didn't have the brain space, to be perfectly honest. I'd been brought up through or trained through wine, so I kind of knew my wine to some extent. And now I was adding spirits onto that, adding beer, adding beer to the level in which I could write about it in a kind of coherent and interesting way. That was just an area that was too difficult for me. And anyway, Michael Jackson was still around, so what hope did I have? Yeah, I mean, I love it and I'm really interested in it and I find it fascinating. But yeah, a bit like you, Arthur, it's there as something I can just chill and relax with and not test myself intellectually about it. So yeah.
Okay, well, you have taxed yourself. Tell me, what have you found out?
I'm not a beer historian. I know I love beer. I drink beer. But I don't have huge in-depth knowledge about beer production or indeed beer history. So, but this was too interesting a rabbit hole not to dive down. But thankfully, alongside me, in terms of written word, was Martin Cornell, whose book Amber, Gold, and Black. If you haven't got it, get it. It's amazing history of beer in the UK. Well worth reading. His blog is well worth looking at as well. So a lot of the references which I picked up were thanks to Martin. So it's a huge thanks to him. Brilliant writer. And it comes back to this thing called porter. We tend not to think about porter these days. You occasionally see it on beer taps, on labels, etc., etc. But it's not front of mind when it comes to beer styles. We're all kind of going down this kind of crazy hopped stuff from America, etc. But porter was the first worldwide beer style and accompanied British people, English people initially, British people, the military, the traders, as they rampaged around the world, stealing land and exploiting people. Porter would be there with them. And originally it started off as a specialty beer made in London. The soft water apparently helped making porter. The big names in those early days of porter brewers, and it was the beer that made them their fortunes. Sir Benjamin Truman, Truman's Breweries, Samuel Whitbread, you'll heard him. Henry Thrale, again famous in terms of beer history, the Calvert family as well. The start of the bureaucracy, who became very important, perhaps not as influential in the 18th and early 19th century as the plantocracy, the slave owners in the Caribbean making the rum, but the bureaucracy had a real power by the middle of the 19th century. So politically, really important. So the first account of porter getting made comes from a letter which was written into the London Chronicle in 1760 by a person calling themselves Obadiah Poundage, clearly a made-up name. And it was a protest about the raising of taxes. A really interesting letter. And essentially Poundage is saying that porter had been made in this particular style, the style of beer, well brewed, kept in its proper time, became racy and mellow, neither new nor stale, recommending itself to the public. Porter. And then another book which I found by a man called Peter Matthias, came out in 1959. It's called The Brewing Industry in England, 1700 to 1830. Matthias says that porter was first brewed in 1722 in the Bell Brewery in Southwark by Ralph Harwood. And it's a very different style of beer than ale. Ale was actually a relatively difficult style to make. Porter was easier to make and easier to make in larger quantities as well. Brewing at a higher temperature. The malt being used was kilned to a higher temperature over wood fire, so it's like smoky to begin with. It lost its smokiness over time, for this was an aged beer. And it was aged in huge vats. I mean, vast. As porter got bigger, so the vats got bigger as well. And that tended to mean it initially was made by the larger brewers. The length of the time that it was aged, which was up to 2 years, encouraged the growth of Brettanomyces, which gives this kind of horse blankety smell, aroma to it. Big in Belgian beers as well, deliberate inoculation with Brettanomyces. And that gave it this kind of tart, slightly savoury character. So it was thick, it was strong, it was black, so you get 7.1%, 7%. That is the kind of the start of it all. And by the time it was building in popularity towards the tail end of the 18th century, brewers began sending two different styles to pubs. So they would sell a fresh style known as mild, which is kind of slightly lighter, it was quite young, it was quite fresh, and this other kind of older style porter, which was strong, aged up to 2 years, which they called stale. And this would then be blended in the pubs themselves, which kind of leads to an interesting idea of you knowing which particular pub had the best style of porter. And it just begins to explode all across England initially, then up to Scotland. The first record of porter getting brewed in Scotland was in Glasgow, thank you very much, 1763, and then over to Ireland, to Dublin, where a small brewer called Guinness began to produce it.
And if I can go back, you mentioned Guinness, if I can go back just a tiny bit to what you said about this idea of the stale and the mild and the two beers being mixed. I wondered, do you think that is part of where this idea of the very best pint of Guinness, where you can get the very best pint of Guinness, which you still hear today, but I think it's a bit overblown because with modern Guinness, it's incredibly consistent. That's one of the great things about it. In a bad pub, you can probably get a decent pint of Guinness, with some exceptions. Some places it's terribly kept, terribly poured in the wrong glass, etc. But we still talk about this idea that Guinness varies. And is that a hangover of because it would have varied a lot in the past?
Yeah, exactly, Arthur. And actually, if you read the books, that was the way that Guinness was poured and Guinness was served, really up until the nitrogen fed lines came on. It was this mixing within the pub. So in a way, you then, as a drinker, you would know which pubs served the best pint, because it was actually quite a hard drink to pour, and the skill of the bartender in making, the perfect pint of Guinness, the perfect pint of porter was really important. Really important, if you would like to say. So I thought, since we're talking about porter, I'll have a porter which is produced by the finest old local brewery called Harvey's, where I am down south of England.
And not a brewery I know, so always great to try something new. Thank you for the suggestion, Dave.
This is brewed to an 1859 recipe, and just wonderful. It's lower strength than it would have been. Look at that. What a beautiful head on that.
Oh, that's good.
Quite soft. It's got this wonderful balance of kind of slightly sweet to begin with, and then that bitter edge comes in. That quite a tart character coming through in the finish. It's hopped, but it's not aggressively hopped, and it's got that great chocolatey length, and then bitter on the finish.
That's very nice beer. So, where were we in the story of porter?
So you begin to see this by the 19th century, that the porter is in its ascendancy. Right up until the middle of the 19th century, this is a beer that people are going to be drinking. But then, and this is an interesting parallel also with rum. Rum was a very popular middle-class drink all the way through the 18th century. It was a classy drink to have, imported, more expensive, etc., etc. Porter, drunk by everyone. But by the middle of the 19th century, beer-wise, what you begin to see is pale ales beginning to come in. And pale ales are the drink of the middle classes. And porter becomes, once again, the drink of the working classes. So you see this real division taking place. And porter's popularity just begins to go on the slide.
Well, actually, before we go any further, have we neglected to actually talk about the difference between porter and stout, although it's not straightforward?
Yeah, the difference between stout and porter. I've looked at this. I've got into a number of beer chat groups, etc., and there's still a debate that's raging in the beer world. Essentially, they're the same thing, or they started off as being the same thing. Stout was the English term for strong. So a stout porter was the strongest style of porter. And then they began to kind of diverge in styles towards the end of the 19th century. There was this kind of clear difference between stout, which was the stronger porter, which then began to kind of diminish and fall away, and then other beers. So it was kind of this kind of later 19th century. And you begin to see stout being made in a slightly different way, that the malt wasn't quite roasted quite as heavily. It became slightly sweeter than the porter. It was still stronger than porter, however. And then you get variations on the stout theme, which begin to come in. So you have oatmeal stout, which you still see to some extent. Sam Smith's still making oatmeal stout. Various other brewers making it as well. You have milk stout as well. This is simply made by adding milk sugar into the mash. And McEwan's, let's be Scottish with this, McEwan's, Tennant's, Calders of Alloa, all made milk stouts. And obviously the most famous of them all is Mackeson's as well. And you begin to then, at the beginning of the 20th century, you're beginning to see stout as having been given these health-giving properties. So you're almost going back to the origins of porter, going, it's nourishing. Now it's actually good for you. And I think a small brewer in Dublin began using that as a marketing slogan until health and safety closed them down.
You mentioned McEwan's there. Is there any truth in the often heard rumour that you actually receive 10 pence from every can of every sale of McEwan's beer in return for the use of your likeness, Dave?
Yeah, in the old days, yeah. I earned a huge amount of money. I earned more money from that than I did from writing books. Sadly, I am now grey of beard and hair, so I'm afraid those royalties have disappeared. Yeah, c'est la vie. Yeah. Anyway, getting back to where we were. Right. Yeah. So health-giving qualities. Guinness used to be prescribed to nursing mothers, to the best of my knowledge. Perhaps if there's any doctors watching, you can say whether that is still the case or not. But there was something about stout that apparently was good for nursing mothers, so it could be prescribed on the national health. I don't know if my mother ever had some, but maybe that's where my love of this particular style of beer came from. Who knows?
Sorry to interrupt, actually, Dave. I had a look to see if I could find any prescriptions, any documents that actually showed people getting prescribed Guinness on the NHS. Because you hear it so often. And actually online, there were lots of people in chat rooms giving testimony, telling anecdotes of when they or their mother or their auntie or someone they knew had been given Guinness. But I couldn't actually find any. No doubt it happened. Anyhow, where we got to? We've done the 17th up to the 19th century, I think.
So to summarise, you've got this style of beer which is made from the 1720s onwards, which is mass-produced, which is big, it's thick, it's sour, it's strong. It becomes the style of beer which is spread throughout the world. So it doesn't matter where you are around the world, you will find porter either being brewed or being exported or imported if you're in one of those countries. And then from the middle of the 19th century, its popularity begins to decline slightly. So that by the 20th century, really until relatively recently, porter especially was a forgotten style, and stout was essentially, brewed predominantly just by Irish brewers.
So now we're talking about Irish brewers and, of course, Guinness. It's quite interesting, this position, I think, that Guinness has within the category of beer, that it is almost risen above the category it sits in, stout, which is in turn a subset of porter. The people ordering a pint of Guinness, they don't even think sometimes that they're drinking a stout. It is its own thing. And in that sense, it reminds me of Bacardi and how people order a Bacardi and Coke. And if the bars run out of Bacardi, they don't want a white rum and Coke. They want a Bacardi and Coke. And Guinness has almost reached this hallowed position that any brand owner or marketeer would dream of. And possibly it may have become the last and only stout. It's not out. It's a sliding doors thing because, of course, the craft beer movement comes along and starts to revive a lot of these styles. But it almost could have got there. It was heading in that direction before this fantastic craft beer revival. What do you think?
I mean, it is. It's almost. Yeah, I could see that happening. I think there was, Guinness was ubiquitous. I remember I briefly ran a pub before I began writing full time, and we had a kind of weird falling out with Guinness, and I looked around for other stouts, and Murphy's suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And that was kind of a really kind of radical thing to have, to have a pub that didn't have Guinness for a while. It was the beer to have. And there was always going to be a Guinness tap. And one reason is it's an excellent beer. But yeah, I think that analogy with Bacardi is a valid one. But thank goodness for craft brewing and reviving so many of these older styles and showing the variations. But also it's kind of doing Guinness down to a certain extent because of what I'm about to reveal, because
you're right, actually. That is a bit harsh because Bacardi is too light for me to be considered a good rum. whereas Guinness is a good stout. And I would not want to criticise my old friend because it's so often the best pint in a bad pub and also a very good pint in a good pub. So it does a fantastic job within the category. Anyway, sorry, I've sidetracked us a little bit. Where are we getting to?
What we've looked at so far is really what happened to porter and stout in the early days in Britain. But it's the export side which are really wanting to kind of dig into here. And the export in particular into the Caribbean. Now, the earliest record really of what people were eating and drinking in the Caribbean colonies, in the sugar colonies, please do watch our earlier Liquid Antiquarian on Scotland and slavery and rum about that. Comes from a man called Richard Lygon, and Lygon was moved to Barbados. He wrote a really fascinating account of what life was like there. And in his description of what people were eating and drinking in Barbados, he writes about the imports, the supplies which were coming from England. And so we have barrels of meal close put up, which comes to us very sweet from England and Holland, of which we make bread, pie crust and puddings. And for drink, good English beer, French and Spanish wines, with others, some from the Madeiras, some from Fayal, I don't really know, and one of the islands of the Azores. Thank you, Richard. So there we are. We cannot justly complain of want either of bread or drink, and from England, spirits, some of aniseeds, some of mint, some of wormwood, etc. And from France, brandy, which is extremely strong, but accounted very wholesome. So there you have good English beer being drunk by the early colonists in Barbados. And in 1695, you have the Anchor Brewery shipping 15 tons of XX beer, so strong beer, porter, to Barbados. Little joke in there. And there's another really interesting book that I turned up, which is called Social Life in the Reign of Queen Anne, taken from original sources. This came out in 1882. And in it, again, this is a really fascinating chapter about exports and about food and drink in the time of Queen Anne. And it says in there, and this is again from one of the original sources, any merchant that has occasion for pale ale and stout to send to the West Indies may at any time be supplied at the Fountain Brewhouse by the Hermitage with beer for shipping at reasonable rates. So there we have it. We have pale ale, but in particular, we have stout and porter being exported because higher strength, higher levels of hop, greater chance of the beer being preserved for a long, long sea voyage.
Ah, yes. The kind of beer that went into our cask that made our delicious rum, which is developing beautifully, by the way. And do we know anything about how this beer was received or how it developed?
In the beginning of the 19th century, 1801, in fact, Guinness started to test market, if you want to use a 20th century term for the 19th century, this stronger, more highly hopped, superior porter. And that, beer historians suggest, is the very first beer which was specifically brewed for the West Indies, which suggests strength and high hops for preservative reasons, but also perhaps, is this being brewed to suit a palate which is now demanding specific flavors? So it was stronger, it was more higher hopped, it was made in this kind of old style of the mild blended with the sour stale porter, and it was being renamed Guinness Foreign Export Stout, or Foreign Extra Stout rather. And that's what we're going to be opening now. And this is strong. It's a strong beer, 7.5%. Black as pitch. So here we have it, Slanger. And the difference between that and the Harveys. The Harveys is lighter, that a little bit sweeter, This is really sour, slightly stale. It's got a wonderful kind of mashy, it's like standing next to a mash tun in a distillery. It's got this wonderful kind of mashy, drafty smell to it. Kind of horse blankets as well, that kind of Britannomyces thing. It's full-bodied, it's rich, it's got that wonderful kind of bitterness coming through. It's not like, I struggle with a lot of really high-strength beers because they quite often are too sweet and you can feel they just get a bit ponderous somehow. This has got freshness to it, freshness and liveliness and bitterness coming through. I want to touch on bitterness and health-giving properties or perceived health-giving properties perhaps a little bit later. And maybe that's one reason why this becomes popular in hotter climates, because it's not big and heavy and it doesn't taste hugely alcoholic and sweet. It's actually got this kind of dry, refreshing style to it. So if it's going to be served cold, delicious, delicious beer. So you'll find variations on this for an extra stout being made all around the world. So local breweries brewing a highly hopped beer, and then Guinness shipping out Guinness flavour extract, shipping that to Dublin, and that then blended in with the locally brewed beer. Essentially, what's happening is you've got the old mild and stale being mixed together. And this then allows Guinness to be made in different territories where different cereals are being used. So you see Nigerian Guinness being made from sorghum, but again, there's a standard flavour coming through thanks to what's coming out from Dublin. But yeah, an absolute cracker. So Ireland also then becomes a significant player in the export of porter or stout. And there were 2,000 barrels of porter being exported from Cork alone at the beginning of the 19th century, specifically, again, to the West Indies and also to some extent to the United States. So if you wanted to know about where these casks are coming from, here's the clue. There's a vast amount of beer getting shipped out in cask from England, from Scotland, from Ireland, across to the West Indies, across to the Caribbean, brewed in a style which either suited the palate or suited the climate or was able to be stabilized because of the way in which it was brewed. It became part and parcel of the beer offering over there. I'll go back to this wonderful book from Matthias, and he was researching shipments of beer from Bristol to the West Indies at the start of 19th century. And what his research showed was that at the start of the century, most of the shipping was actually in bottles, but by the 1820s, most of it was going out in casks as well. And then you have that idea that at Cork, again, it was mostly casks that were going out. So it was an interesting one that, to begin with, bottles were going out, then casks were going out, and then bottles were going out again towards the tail end of the 19th century, although casks were still being shipped out at that time. And I think in terms of coming back to our book, if you think about casks of porter and casks of stout going out at that particular point, this is when rum is taking off. And rum is incredibly popular. Rum's growing in popularity. What are they going to put it into? Here's some extra casks, which are coming in there. And that's a wonderful, neat theory, and it all seemed to be kind of tied up with a bow. And then I thought, well, I've always been intrigued. You kind of say in terms of whiskey. Well, jump to whiskey for a second. Think in terms of being able to redress the balance of this idea that all Scotch whisky was matured in sherry casks in the 19th century, which simply isn't true. You look at the records and you see wine casks were used, brandy casks were used, yes, sherry casks were used, but actually a lot of them were in decline towards the tail end of the 19th century. And rum casks were used as well. And that's great, tick, 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 tick. We've now got a greater variety of flavours being used and different cask types and being used by the Scotch whisky industry. But then spin that back and you think, well, in terms of rum, where are the casks coming from in the first place? Stout. Well, actually, yeah, shipped across. Stout was emptied, filled with rum, shipped all the way back. Thank you very much. Neat. Again, tied up with a neat little bow. So I asked Richard Seal, who's a fantastic distiller, Foursquare Distillery in Barbados, about casks, and mentioned stout cask, and porter cask being regarded as, the a ne plus ultra of maturing vessels for rum. And Richard's reply was immediate. He said, "I can't imagine a worse cask to age rum in." Although I think we've proved him incorrect this once with this fantastic Worthy Park. But in terms of what casks, how the rum distillers were using casks, they weren't only reliant on casks coming from Europe. They were importing staves from North America. In fact, there was a huge trade in North American wood coming down in exchange for molasses, etc., etc. As a result of that, you've got rum being aged in new wood being shipped across to Britain, and then that new cask being used in Scotch whisky.
Dave, now I can bring us right back pleasingly to the J. Davies book, because in there's reference to the amount of new wood that was used for the rum casks that were being shipped over to Britain, and also mention of the firing of those casks, and presumably a recognition of the effect on flavour, which I found interesting.
So that is a very, very different flavour profile to what we think of as rum casks now, because these days, rum casks being used for finishing Scotch whisky will be originally second, third fill Scotch or Irish whisky casks shipped to the Caribbean, used in the Caribbean to age rum, then shipped back over here. So knackered wood with a big slush of rum in there. But in the 19th century, fresh wood, first fill casks, lots of activity, lots of rum. So think in terms of what that flavour profile gave, far less the stout casks. I think all of a sudden we've kind of opened up yet another little rabbit hole that we can perhaps dive down at some point, Arthur.
Yeah, for another day, because else we'll never get this episode done. But it does trigger the thought in me now, which I would just briefly like to say, how distillers in Britain would have had unlimited supplies of these porter casks because it was drunk in great quantities over here. Yet I don't think I have seen any early records of whiskey matured in porter or stout casks, and into the 19th century as well. So they were choosing not to.
That's very true. I don't see that. You really don't see beer casks being used for whiskey maturation at all. Don't know. Maybe Richard Seal was right. Maybe the style of beer being made in Britain wasn't. So I don't know.
But then maybe you think about some of those early beer cask matured whiskies, the experiments like Grant's ale cask, for example. They were a bit iffy, weren't they?
Yeah, but that said, there have been some really successful ones. The Glenfiddich IPA was fantastic, but they kind of went that extra mile by working with the brewer to brew a beer that had a flavour profile that suited maturation, which would then match with the whiskey. So they went into fairly granular detail in terms of what flavours that they particularly wanted from the beer. So the beer essentially specifically brewed for that purpose. Delicious beer that it was. Jameson did a very good one as well with a local Cork brewer as well. And once again, working very, very closely. So it wasn't just like picking up a cask and putting whiskey into it. And I think some of the very early ones essentially were just that. And, flavour-wise, it just, there was a clash rather than harmony working. But it is interesting why you see stout casks getting used for aging rum and shipping across and being seen as being positive, but no mention of Scotch whisky distillers of that particular time using local beer casks. So yeah, a mystery. Anyone who has any ideas on that, please, you know where to find us. I love this. I love the fact about Liquid Antiquarian is that we're not here to answer all questions. We ask as many questions as we answer. That's my way of getting around that problem. Anyway, So what you've got now is stout and porter becoming increasingly important to West Indies in terms of the beer style, the approved and beloved beer style. So that you've got brewers actually brewing specifically for those markets. And I looked at a book called 5 Years Residence in the West Indies by Charles William Day, Esquire, which came out in 1852. And Day's account is a really intriguing one. He was a bit of a snob. He seemed to disapprove of drunkenness amongst the working classes and thoroughly approved of it among the plantation owners as well. And it's a few little kind of quotes in here from him, and the way in which he was speaking specifically every time, really, about porter and stout as being the most consumed style of beer. So we have him saying, the country planters are very different to the people of Port of Spain. If you come within hail of a planter's dwelling house, you're warmly invited in, and sangaree, ale or porter is forthwith produced. And then he goes on to describe cocktails, like beer cocktails, mixed drinks, using porter and stout. Here we go. The West Indies is the country for drinks and for the most extravagant intemperance. Imagine a draught of delectable compound composed of brandy, rum, wine, and porter with lime peel and nutmeg. This compound is appropriately designated rattle skull. In fact, there's a free and easy style of living here worthy of Ireland in its palmiest days. And you also have this other drink called Flip, which was made in kind of a similar way, not as quite brutally strong as Rattle Skull. But what you're seeing is porter and stout are integral parts of the drinking culture in the Caribbean by the 19th century. And by the tail end of the 19th century, if you begin to look at the local newspapers, in particular, I looked at the Gleaner from Jamaica, which is a fantastic archive, and you begin to see all the different advertisements for the imported stouts which were appearing. Belhaven Brewery had a specifically brewed Trinidad stout. You've got Guinness, you have Cork brewers coming in, you've got Whitbread, you have Bass, you have Muir, you have McEwen's, Calder's, you have Tennant as well. All of these breweries, all these major breweries supplying the Caribbean to the extent that, and again, something which I had never realized, that Tennant's actually had its own house in Havana. So Casa de Tennant's, where you could go and drink Tennant's lager and Tennant's stout. So there you go. I don't know why that fills me with a certain degree of pride. I think it should, shouldn't it? This kind of says to me that a couple of different things are happening, because you've got porter and stout in decline in Britain, still popular in Ireland, but certainly in decline in England and Scotland, whereas it has maintained its status as the drink of choice in the Caribbean, and has retained that, I would say, right up until today. And much more kind of lager style beers are drunk there, but stout and porter have really clung on very strongly in the Caribbean. But why might that be the case? And again, so looking at various accounts and various theories, there's a whole number of different suggestions put forward as to why the West Indies held on to this idea of stout. And one thing was health-giving properties. Bitterness was seen as a positive attribute in a beer. That actually meant it was going to be doing you good. Bitterness was a positive in terms of health. So beer which was bitter wasn't just something that was refreshing, it was actually used as a medicine, as a folk medicine almost. So there's that theory. There's another theory that there was a mass immigration of Irish over to the Caribbean, potato famine, etc., a lot to America, but also into the Caribbean. And this is kind of post-plantation era. So they were coming in at a fairly low level, societal level, and they're drinking porter, and they're bringing their palate with them, and they're maintaining the interest in port and porter and stout. There's also another theory that porter and stout are simply beers that match very well with spicy food, so they're allying into the local cuisine. And you see the popularity of Guinness in Sri Lanka. You see it in Nigeria. You see it in a whole number of different countries around the world. India as well, actually. Where the food is spicier and beer is being drunk, but the beer that's being drunk actually has higher strength and a bit more hop and a bit more roasted qualities. Therefore, maybe that's another reason. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe you've got your own pet theory, Arthur.
Well, no great insights, I'm afraid. But I would say that I did, on your recommendation, actually cook some nice curry, mildly spiced curry, medium spiced curry. And I had the Guinness with that curry, and it worked really well. And I've been so conditioned to the idea that with a curry, you have a cold fizzy lager. But this works so much better. It was a really great combination and really surprised me. So I urge people to try that. And it did make me think of that time when I worked in the Caribbean on a ship when I was like 17, 18 years old. And I've just found it odd to see these Caribbean men in various islands I went to in the West Indies and drinking this stout. And it just seemed like the very opposite of what you should be drinking in a kind of warm, lovely Caribbean island. But then we drink cold fizzy lager in Daventry, Scotland. So, who knows? People make odd cultural decisions or odd things kind of stick. But yeah, Guinness for an extra stout with curry really works well.
Yeah. We do drink lager, and I think the Cubans agreed actually in the Casa de Tenants. It's great, again, this is open for comments. Any ideas as to why this might have been the case? I think there's a whole mass of different reasons. I think it's availability. I think there's just standard practice, of what was being exported into the Caribbean for then a very long period of time. It just became part and parcel of what people drank. There weren't all that many, there were no breweries there. So everything was reliant on what was being imported. As a result, that was always what was drunk. That was always what was made. Boom. That's what you're going to be getting. So perhaps that had something to do with it. Economics kind of lie at the heart of it all. But really, to kind of wind this up, this is a very big rabbit hole here. Again, I was reading one of Martin Cornell's blogs and came across this term of draft porter and wet sugar. And here we have a direct connection between rum and porter in the Caribbean. So draft porter, or drought porter, as it was also known, is a drink which was very much the one that was consumed by the working class, certainly in Jamaica. The first mention of drought porter or draft porter, and I'll use both terms, appears in the 1870s. And it's not a cereal-based beer. It's a cheap fermented drink which is made from wet sugar. So what's wet sugar? I know you were about to ask me that question, Arthur. So by the end of the 19th century, what you see is Jamaica's sugar plantations are using modern technology to make dry or muscovado sugar. Okay, but you've still got a lot of small-scale farmers who might be working the sugar estate, but they also have their own farmhouse. They've got some chickens, they've got some pigs, etc., and they will have their own stand of cane, and they'll have a boiler. And they'll press the cane and they'll boil it up, but they'll boil it up once. They won't be able to make sugar. They won't be able to make sugar in the same way as the larger sugar factories are. And the result of this kind of single boiling of sugar juice is wet sugar. And wet sugar is still made in very, very small quantities in the Westmoreland in Jamaica today. There's a couple of newspaper clips kind of showing that and talking about it being almost like a lost art, but it's still going on. So the drink of the poor, the drink of the working class, really cheap, sold a penny halfpenny a glass. You could buy it in bars, in grocery stores, on the street, in kind of quart cans or pint cans or gill shots, etc., etc. It would be used for sweetening ice cream, or it would be fermented into this drink as well. The wet sugar would be used in ice cream, and the fermented drink would be consumed. So it's now porter then now stops being just this imported beer. Porter, Draught porter, becomes an indigenous drink of Jamaica. So again, this is kind of underlying the importance of porter and stout to the wider community. So they're now identifying with this particular drink. That's why they're calling it Draught porter, draft porter. It is theirs. It's really important. 1939, there's a tax. The Jamaican government wants to increase the tax on porter by 4 times, and that would really damage this disproportionately damage the draft porter trade. And the proposal actually was withdrawn. And I thought all of this is really interesting. Here we have this development of this indigenous drink, draft porter, and then went back to this. It kind of reminded me of something that I'd read in that book about the occasion, the drink being consumed in the time of Queen Anne, and it's right at the very beginning of that chapter on food and drink, and the quotation goes like this: "Beer has always been the alcoholic liquor most largely consumed in England, and among the poorer and lower middle classes. It was so in Anne's reign, but it was looked down upon and despised by the upper classes. It was of different qualities, from the penny nipperkin of molasses ale to a pint of ale cost me 5p. The penny nipperkin of molasses ale. Now that's interesting. So molasses would be coming in by this point from the Caribbean, from the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. So was the equivalent of draft or Draught porter a drink which was being consumed at Queen Anne's time in London? Was it made there and then the idea shipped back across to the Caribbean? Did it start off in the Caribbean and the idea comes back to Britain? Or did they spontaneously appear round about the same time? I don't know. Arthur, what do you think?
It does actually trigger some thoughts. I pulled this down because I thought it might come up, and indeed it has. So I'm reading this very lengthy report for the House of Commons, published in 1831, looking into the possibility of allowing molasses in brewing and distilling. There is financial distress out in the plantations of the West Indies, and so effectively they're looking to lobby the government to open up molasses into a new market into the UK for brewing and distilling, which is not permitted under current legislation because it would interfere with the way they measure gravity and strength, and therefore tax at that point. And there's lots of interesting little snippets. I must admit I was reading it more from the perspective of distilling rather than brewing, but there is reference to molasses being able to be used in porter and table beer, but not fine ales. And there are also indications, and that's why the big brewers want to keep it out, is that people are making some kind of molasses-based beer in a cottage industry sense or an illicit brewing sense. So it's possible. And then the second thing that I had was actually from our book in J. Davies, which mentions the use of treacle, brewing of porter, although there are a few other ingredients in this recipe that would not have been permitted by law at that point. But then, of course, this is possibly a butler doing it, or possibly a innkeeper doing it, so working outside the law and not a commercial brewer. illicit though it would have been. But that does tie it up rather nicely back to our original recipe. But one day soon, I hope we can return to talk about this potential that there was, that molasses would have come in large quantities and would have started to be used instead of barley or homegrown cereals if the West Indian lobbyists had got their way. And it's a fork in the road that could have meant that the British distilling industry could have turned out very, very differently and without single malt whiskey at its heart if the West Indian lobbyists had got their way. But that's something to return to, Dave.
Definitely, yes. Let's go down there, because I think that's a vast area that's never really been discussed. So yeah. You see how these things lead to other stuff, you know? One tiny reference to a stout cask, suddenly, boom, yeah, we're off. We're currently in Jamaica. I know we're talking now about that shift from porter starting off in London speciality, suited to London soft water, begins to expand across England, into Scotland, into Ireland, begins to be exported. Specific styles getting made for the West Indies. The West Indies falling in love with it, becoming an integral part of their portfolio of drinks, their drinks culture. The emergence of this thing called draft porter or drought porter, the molasses-based drink, which is a kind of weird little link into rum itself. And then brewing stout in the West Indies itself. So the first, according to Martin Cornell, and I believe him, is going to be in Kingston in Jamaica, 1875, by R. Craig. Frank Erskine and Company brewed stout between 1889 and 1900. Edwin Charley started the wonderfully named Cock brand in 1892. Stop laughing. And that firm was then taken over by Ray and Nephew rum distillers. And all of these stouts, so there's a difference in terms of recipe, in terms of the Jamaican stouts, which are brewed locally. All are beginning to use molasses for colouring, and I would argue probably flavour as well. So 1908 in Trinidad, Richard Walter, he was an Irish expat, he was a trader. He owned the Trinidad Brewing Company. He began to make Royal Extra Stout, and Royal Extra Stout is still made today. I couldn't get hold of it. I wonder if it is available in the UK. If it is, let me know. I really want to get hold of it. I haven't had it since I was last in Trini. It's now made by Carib and can rightly claim to be the oldest continuously brewed Caribbean beer. But the one that we are about to try now, Arthur, is the wonderful Dragon Stout from Jamaica. And this is made by D&G, who are probably best known for Red Stripe. And they originally imported stout and porter from Canada. They imported Guinness, and they also imported McEwen's. Dragon Stout, which we're having here, first was brewed in 1924, then there was a milk stout, and then it was reformulated in 1961 as a kind of sweet stout, which again takes us right back to draft porter, the sweet style. And it is a lot sweeter. This is 7.5%, and it is a sweet stout. It's much thicker. It's more licorice in terms of like licorice, the sweet, but also liqueur-like, much more kind of central sweetness to it. It doesn't have quite the drive and the bitter edge of the Guinness. The Guinness really kind of powers all the way through the palate. This is kind of a big impact up front. But again, a delicious drink. You know, a little bit sweeter, a bit more of that kind of molasses coming through on the finish. Whether it is molasses or not, I don't know. Maybe I should look at the label. Does it say? No, it doesn't. That kind of molasses thing. Water, malted barley, sugar, glucose syrup, colour, hop extract. So no molasses in there, but it's certainly got that real kind of sweetness to it. But the finish still isn't too cloying. It's still quite dry.
I like it, but it's on the edge of being a touch too sweet for me personally. But it's still a really nice drink if you're in the right mood for it. And chilled a bit, I think helps. But as we come close to wrapping up now, Dave, I just wanted to acknowledge this link also not just with beer and rum and Jamaica and British culture, but not just the alcohol, but also the music that's travelled with it. Of course, with music, you enjoy a drink as well. And I suppose Red Stripe has this place in society as being arguably the beer of the music scene, and presumably that's to do with the huge impact that Jamaican music had, not just in Jamaica and around the world, but especially in London, and how these beers got cemented as a drink in certain venues in London and then spread elsewhere. Beer, alcohol, just as well as music, kind of travels with people as part of culture. And I found a few nice examples of that where it's directly tied.
Yeah, I used to drink at the Star and Garter down at St Paul's, which was just an incredible pub. There's a guy in the back room, DJ Derek, who's very famous for those of you who love old school reggae and dub. And DJ Derek would be there in the back room with like 2 turntables and just playing amazing music. And Hector, who was the landlord, would have a lock-in every night. And when he locked you in, he genuinely locked you in. And even though you wanted to actually leave to go home, to go to bed, or perhaps go to work, depending on how long the session went on, he wouldn't let you out. It was he would only let you out when he wanted to open the doors again. And it was just a wonderful community down there. Yeah, I love my time down there drinking Red Stripe. I didn't drink Stout. I drank Red Stripe. And so we've gone full circle, Arthur. One small reference to rum and stout casks suddenly opens up this whole amazing saga of a style of beer that perhaps we've heard about in terms of porter. We know about stout. In terms of porter, we've heard about it. We might have seen it on taps, but we don't really know what the true history of porter was, as the incredible global success of this particular beer and the way in which it took over all of the British Isles. It then became the beer to drink all the way around the world, and then retains this center of power in the West Indies for various reasons that we still haven't fully discerned, but it becomes a cultural phenomenon over there. A drink which is still consumed, and a drink which is still being made, by Guinness to suit that particular palate over there. I find it fascinating. It's been a great one to dive down into, because that is what we do. We want to ask these questions. We want to come up with solutions. We want to try and find all these obscure references and try and piece together this story about how all of these drink styles somehow become intertwined. We tend to think about, well, we're just going to talk about whiskey, and it's going to be down here, or we're just going to talk about rum or champagne or beer or whatever, and they're all in their own they're on their own train tracks. But it's not true. It's not like that. It's a mess. It's a web of interconnected drinks and cultures and economics and politics and flavor preferences and culture that pulls all of drink together. And you can pull on one strand and boom, you'll be down looking at so many other things. I've really enjoyed it.
As have I, Dave. Thank you so much. Congratulations and cheerio.
Farewell. We'll see you soon.